It's spring again, well, at least for a few more hours. You'll probably hear the sounds of spring in the background. Red-winged blackbirds are singing. My neighbor's got the leaf blower out. The year-round song of the suburbia, I guess. Anyway, today our subject are the two extant orders of Paleoptera, the Ephemeroptera and the Odonata. Let's get started. So first of all, you recall that there's lots of uh, uncertainty over whether or not the Paleoptera, the modern Paleoptera, represent a monophyletic group, or even in a larger sense, whether the Paleoptera as a whole represent a monophyletic group. Of course, we can only get molecular data for the modern species, and those data, even in something as intense as the One Kite project with over 1,400 protein coding genes, did not have sufficient evidence to come to, well, at least what they considered to be a definitive answer about whether or not the Ephemeroptera and the Odonata form a monophyletic group. But they do have some things in common, some of which we've come to believe have evolved independently, but be that as it may, there are some features that they share that I would like to cover here. First of all, with very few exceptions within the Odonata, both of these orders, all of the species have immature stages that are aquatic. Like I say, there are a few exceptions here and there in highly moist environments. But otherwise, at least all the species around here, all of them have aquatic immature stages. Secondly, obviously, from the name Paleoptera, we know that these species do not have wing flexion. That is, they cannot fold the wings over the dorsum of the body and to have them lie flat against the body. The wings are either held outspread at right angles to the longitudinal axis of the body, or I guess both this and the way can't make my arms go backward another 90 degrees. Both of those are at 90 degrees to the longitudinal axis of the body. But all Odonata and Ephemeroptera in the adult stages cannot flex the wings over the back. Thirdly, and this is one of the characters that is probably independently derived, and so it's kind of a false similarity in the sense that it doesn't indicate ancestry, but that is the structure of the antennae. And here we have the head of a damselfly, in which you can see the antennae, and they're of a shape that is called aristate, which arista is simply a bristle, typically a large bristle. If you're familiar with what the antennae look like on muscoid flies, so the common house fly or flesh flies or things like that, they have an arista arising from the third antennal segment. And this is thought to look similar. They don't have large, elongate antennae here. Now, when you look at the fossil stages, a lot of these characters that we used to recognize modern representatives of these orders just fall apart. Now, we're not going to get into the fossils today, but we concentrate on the recent species. And let's see, the last characteristic I wanted to point out was that these insects all rely on what's called direct flight musculature in order to fly. Most insects have at least some muscles that function as indirect flight muscles. And okay, so the difference between direct and indirect. A direct flight muscle moves the wing by virtue of a muscle contracting, and that contraction pulls directly on the base of the wing or on a tendon that's attached to the wing. So that's a direct flight muscle. An indirect flight muscle, on the other hand, causes a distortion in the shape of the thorax, and because the wings are connected to the thorax, that indirectly moves the wings. All of the other orders of insects that we're going to look at for the rest of the semester have both direct and indirect flight musculature. Some of them rely on direct flight musculature for the major movements of the wings, but the vast majority of them use the direct flight musculature only to fine-tune the attitude of the wing as it goes through the air, to tilt it down or tilt it up. And the major elevation and depression of the wings is done by indirect flight musculature. That is not true in the two orders that we're going to talk about today. They have direct flight musculature. So let's start out with the mayflies, the order Ephemeroptera. I think I've mentioned before that you'll see it in the older literature commonly called Ephemerata. In both cases, the name refers to the fact that these insects have a very short-lived adult stage, and I'm going to get to that in a second, somewhere here, about in the middle of that bullet list. But first, probably the most unique thing about the Ephemeroptera is that they are the only group of modern insects that has a functionally winged immature stage. The stage is called the subimago. Another name for the sexually mature adult stage is imago. So the subimago is the instar that comes before that. This is unique in all modern insects. If you capture a mayfly that's freshly emerged from the water and you put it in a cage, you can actually watch the subimago molt. They usually do it within a day or two of emerging from the water. And they go from, subimagos as a general rule are kind of drably colored, whereas if there's going to be any bright colors in the mayfly, that comes out in the adult stage. And you can see change in color. They still pretty much look the same, other than being sexually mature as the adult stage. So a subimago, an immature stage with functional wings, is unique among modern insects. Secondly, the Ephemeroptera retain in their immature stages the median caudal filament that we saw, for example, in the Thysanura and the Microcorypheus. So they have both a long median caudal filament and elongate cerci. So if you look at the immature stages, and I'll have a picture coming up here shortly, they look like they have quote unquote three tails. If you look at some of the identification guides for aquatic insects that you sell to fishermen, or you take to summer camps and stuff like that, mayfly immatures are easily identifiable. Gosh, let me try to say that. Identifiable amongst the other insect orders by virtue of having these three elongate appendages on the posterior end of the body. Okay, so the short life stage. Both the subimago and that was a misstatement there. Not short life stage, short adult life stage. The adult in a mayfly typically lives only a day or two. So basically, they're emerging from the water, molting from the subimago to the imago stage, and then they have to mate, and the females have to oviposit, and then story's over. Because that's all they're doing, they do not feed whatsoever. And many of them, perhaps even all of them, I would have to check if there are any exceptions, have vestigial mouth parts. So they're not feeding in the adult stage whatsoever. Conversely, the immature stages can be long-lived. And in some cases, we're even talking years living as in immature stages. And whereas I'm going to have a picture of an adult mayfly here in the next slide, whereas adult mayflies of all families look pretty much like peas in a pod. There's not a whole lot of morphological variability going on in mayflies, at least in terms of the gross aspects of what they look like. The immature stages, in contrast, are very diverse in their morphology, in their biology. Some are filter feeders, some are grazers, some are predatory. They are burrowers into the substrate. They go under rocks. So there's a lot of variety and diversity in the morphology and the ecology of the immature stages of mayflies. One of the I guess many of the unique things I'm talking about mayflies seem to be plesiomorphic characters, so a winged immature stage. We don't have any direct proof that there were ever winged immature stages in the species of fossil insects, but it seems quite possible. The median caudal filament, and then this next character, the paired penis in the male. Now what I mean here is that almost all insects, if they have direct transfer of sperm, so not the indirect transfer of sperm that I talked about in the context of the Thysanura and the Microcoryphea, but direct transfer, the males have an intromittent organ called the ediogus that is used to transfer either the spermatozoa or a package containing spermatozoa, something called a spermatophore, to the female. Mayflies have paired penis, and so if this intromittent organ is ultimately a pair derived from a pair of paired appendages. Even that's redundant, isn't it? Derived from paired appendages on the 9th abdominal segment, then everybody else with the single intromittent organ representing a fusion of those things, that's the apomorphic or derived condition, whereas mayflies have paired penis. And then finally, the nymphs are characterized by having a series of gills on the abdominal segments. And one theory about the origin of wings is that what we see in the fore and hind wings in modern winged insects, those are actually serial homologs of the gills that you see on a mayfly. It's interesting that these gills in mayflies have articulations at their base. They can move, they can generate water currents, not air currents. They're not big enough to fly. And so this has been suggested to be sort of a stage at which features like the musculature and the articulation and the functionality of wings could evolve, even though the structures themselves were too small to be able to enable the insect to fly. They had a real purpose in the immature stages to generate water flow, either to swim through the water or to move water over the gills to extract oxygen, combination of those kinds of things. But it gives the idea of a function. I should also mention here that the immature stages of, well, let's put it this way, the immature stages of insects with complete metamorphosis are almost universally called larvae. I'm sure you know this. And the immature stages of insects with incomplete metamorphosis, gradual metamorphosis, are traditionally called nymphs. But the immature stages of aquatic insects that have gradual metamorphosis are often called naiads. This seems to be more or less a North American term. So it's common amongst entomologists in that continent. You go to Europe and people will refer to immature damselflies, dragonflies, mayflies as larvae there as well. So that's also something to be aware of as you're reading the literature. So that's a lot of words. Let's take a look at some of these things I've been talking about. This is a picture showing the general sort of habitus that practically all adult mayflies have. Typically you have, in modern species, you have 4 wings, F-O-U-R, the number 4, in which the F-O-R-E, the anterior pair of wings, is quite large, and the posterior pair of wings are significantly smaller, or actually in many mayflies, they have lost the posterior, the hind wings entirely, and so basically they just have 1 pair of wings. We see the long caudal filaments, 3 in number. The forelegs are commonly held out in front of the body and can act seemingly something along the lines of organs of touch, stigmotactic organs. These guys, you know, they're not going to be walking around very much. Basically, they're not using their legs for much more as either an adult, here we see the imago, or as the pre-adult stage, the subimago here. Basically, they're just holding on to the substrate and sitting for periods of time while they molt, the exoskeleton hardens, and and they mature. Uh, so they're not walking around a great deal, and the legs are not significantly used for locomotion. What else did I want to say about here? You can kind of get a hint of those aristate, those short antennae, and also get a hint of how the subimago is a little bit more dull colored. Commonly, we have more contrast in the abdomen here and in the wings of the female imago here than we do in the subimago. So basically, really, this is what all, at least in my eyes, what all adult mayflies look like. There are lots of characters to recognize the different families that are based on the wing venation, but as you can see, the wing venation is very complex, and it's quite a task to get your head around where the characters are as you run through the keys. But if you have to do it, it's possible. The immature stages, on the other hand, are very identifiable to the level of family. And so because the adults aren't so much, that's why I haven't pushed that as a identification on you in the lab part of the course. This image, of course, because mayflies are aquatic insects, because they're important parts of the food chain for many sport fisheries. There's tons of pictures available from people who are interested in especially trout and salmon and things like that, because mayflies are a very important component of the diet of those fishes. So you can see troutnut.com is where I borrowed this picture. I borrowed this picture because it's showing the paired peonies, one on this side and one on this side, that are the intromittent organs of male mayflies. These up here are also modifications of the sternum that act as claspers to help hold the female in position during copulation, because copulation takes place in flight. And so they probably need all the help they can do to stay attached to the female. Mayflies often form these huge swarms within which mating takes place, and males locate females primarily visually, and so they have well-developed compound eyes. I think that's the next picture here. Yes. So this is a male mayfly. Let me get you oriented here, because it can be a little bit disconcerting. These are the forelegs down here, and so this is the prothorax. This is the mesothorax here with the forewings attached to it. Ocelli, 3 ocelli. The aristate antennae, so short bristle-like antennae here. I can't see anything in the way of mouth parts on this guy. But of course, the amazing feature about this particular male and lots of species of male mayflies is this feature that is called turbinate eyes. So you imagine somebody wearing a turban on their head, and I don't know how somebody came up with that metaphor to describe what's going on here. But basically, the compound eyes are differentiated into 2 functional parts, where these are looking straight up. And what these are doing is they're looking for females that are flying into the mating swarm. And once they see those, the males can go after the females. So they're finding females visually. I'm pretty sure that I've never heard of mayflies having any long distance pheromones to attract males to females. The sexes find each other by orienting visually, and to enhance that, we have this tremendous I think it's probably safe to say that it's an adaptation of males to be more efficient at finding females. I have a few pictures of some of the immature stages in order to illustrate the morphological diversity that I talked about. So here we have a mayfly. I'm going to call it a naiad. I probably call it a nymph at times. I'll probably never call it a larva unless I really stumble over my words. But here we see this guy, more or less cylindrically shaped. The 3 caudal filaments, so 2 cerci, and the median, the only true caudal filament is the median one. 3 walking legs. They do have functional mouth parts. Of course, the immature stages are the stages that feed. And then you see this series of abdominal gills in more or less a dorsolateral position, which is very similar to the position of wings. These things are musculated, they have articulations at their base, and so the mayfly can basically move those up and down with swirling motions, generate water flow. This is probably a burrower living in a burrow and filter feeding, and so bringing water, generating a flow of water that comes into the burrow, bringing food to the animal that it then consumes. In contrast, this sort of guild of mayflies lives underneath rocks, on the undersurface of rocks, and feeds upon the, well, gosh, the algae, plants, bacteria, whatever's growing on the underside of the rock. Maybe sponges, maybe all sorts of bryozoans and things like that. Anyway, the body is strongly flattened. You see they have well-developed eyes. This is the labrum here. And, well, actually, sorry, this is the frons. And you see the bristle-like antennae coming out. Even the legs are flattened. The 3 caudal filaments, true caudal filament, circus. And if you look closely, you can see the abdominal gills along that edge. I can't really see them on this side of the animal. So these are flat. If you want to find these things, you go into a stream and you pick up rocks and turn them over and look at them. And that's where you'll find these kinds of mayflies. And then this is more of a free swimming sort. I put this on here to show both that the cerci and the caudal filament can have branches off them. And also, this is a great picture of both the abdominal gills and the developing wings. Because these are exopterygote insects, the wing pads develop externally, and you can see them develop and grow as they go through the immature stages in the water. I think this is the last thing I want to say about mayflies in this context. They are notorious in some parts of the country, and Ohio used to be, and I believe is becoming again, an area in which this notoriously happens, that they are notorious for having these mass emergences of, my gosh, I have no idea how many millions, hundreds of millions of mayflies here are emerging at the same time. And they come out, and of course as they emerge from the water, it's the subimago stage, which basically it's not going to feed, it just needs to find a safe resting place to sit and wait to molt into the adult stage, which can then fly off to find a mate. And as these land and sit, they literally cover. These pictures are from up in Lake Erie area a few decades ago. You can see they just absolutely cover everything in sight, and they can become fairly dangerous. The females are full of eggs, and the eggs, of course, are full of yolk, and so as these things get hit by cars, get run over by cars, all of the squishy, gooey parts in the inside make for very, very slick roads and dangerous driving conditions. Even it's almost like a fog here. I mean, this is daytime when these things are flying. You may be more familiar with the idea of maybe not mass emergences, but significant emergences of mayflies if you're a trout fisherman, and trout fishermen, fly fishermen are always looking for that emergence and then matching the lures that they're using to the size and the color of the mayflies that are emerging at that time. As I say, this used to be a common occurrence. I mean, the mayfly bodies would pile up, you know, a foot or two just in terms of the huge numbers that are coming out. The numbers decreased significantly to where this basically stopped for many years. Why? Well, one suggestion has been concerns about pollution and just the deterioration of the aquatic environment in which the insects were living. Another was the introduction of the zebra mussel. The zebra mussel is also a filter feeding animal, and zebra mussels in Lake Erie grew to such tremendous numbers that, believe it or not, they were basically cleaning the water of the organic material. And this is the organic material that the immature mayflies would feed on. And so that caused a decrease in the mayfly populations. They're coming back. And there's starting to be more significant emergences as you go along. If you go up to Lake Erie, you can often just walk along the shore and find that the plants there have lots of mayflies just sitting there, hunkering down on them. Not these huge numbers where they're going to be a traffic hazard, but still significant emergences of mayflies. Okay, let's move on to the other order of insects, Paleopterous insects, and that is the Odonata. The Odonata go by the common names, as I'm sure you know, all entomologists, that these are the dragonflies and the damselflies, and those names pretty much correspond to the two extant suborders of Odonata. The dragonflies are in the Anisoptera, and the damselflies are in the Zygoptera. A couple of things, the few things I want to tell you in particular about the Odonata. So they have 4 functional wings, and in contrast to the mayflies, the fore and the hind wings are pretty much equal in size in terms of length, and there's some variation in breadth, but the fore and hind wings are overall pretty similar, whereas modern mayflies have large forewings and small or non-existent hind wings. Now I should point out that if you go back into the fossil record, the mayfly fossils have large hind wings. So that characteristic of these tiny or absent hind wings in mayflies is only something that's true of modern mayflies. So they have fore and hind wings, and my point here was that they function independently in flight. I've got a video of this that I hope runs correctly. When you think of the really good, other than dragonflies, the really good flyers amongst the insect world, you know, the true flies, the moths, maybe, well, butterflies are okay flyers, I guess, but some of the moths like sphingids are very good flyers. What else do we have? The Hymenoptera, bees and wasps, some of them are very strong flyers. They either only have a single pair of wings that are functional, true flies, or the forewing and the hind wing are joined together mechanically so that they function as a single unit. That is, the terminology we use is that the wings are coupled, and the ways in which wings are coupled vary amongst the different groups. The point at this point in the course is that the dragonflies, not so much the damselflies, they're fairly modest flyers abilities. I have one great exception for you. But particularly dragonflies are extremely adept at flying, so much so that I don't believe I've ever been able to catch a dragonfly on the wing. I've actually stopped trying because it's so difficult. The combination of their tremendous visual acuity and their agility in flying makes them nearly impossible to go out and swing a net at them and catch them. Now, I'm sure there are some people who have developed the knack in order to be able to do it, but my main point is that A, these are very good flyers, but B, their fore and hind wings function independently in flight. They are beating out of synchrony. The two forewings are more or less moving together. You know, if it's turning, you know, they're going to be there's going to be a little bit of difference in the amplitude of the wing beat and whether the leading edge of the wing is pronated or supinated and that kind of stuff. But the hind wings are beating in a different pattern. In all of the other ones, basically the fore and hind wings are beating together because they are mechanically joined to them. Odonata, both in the immature and the adult stages, are really voracious predators and will practically eat anything that they can get their legs or their mouth around and consume. And one of the very amazing things that you see, adult Odonata have a fairly typical set of mandibulate, that is chewing mouth parts. But the immature stages have modified the mouth parts, and specifically have modified the labium as an organ to capture prey. Adult dragonflies capture prey with their legs, and they have very strong bristles along the length of their legs so that they can catch insects in flight. Immature Odonata, are capturing their prey, insects, vertebrates, small fish, tadpoles, depends on how big the nymph is, and it's capturing with a structure called the labial mask, and I'll show you that in just a second. The next point I want to say here is that while the Ephemeroptera have direct sperm transfer via those paired penis, the Odonata retain, to me, it's basically the same kind of thing that we saw in the apterygote orders. They retain indirect sperm transfer. But it's a special kind of indirect sperm transfer in which the male has the gonopore at the posterior apex of the abdomen, ninth abdominal segment. He places sperm in a specialized structure that's located on the underside of the base of his own abdomen, and then the female reaches with her abdomen and takes up those spermatozoa into her reproductive system. So in a sense, it's just like a springtail depositing a spermatophore on the ground that the female has to find. The male might corral her into that, into finding it, but the female has to find it and take it up actively. Same sort of things happening here, except instead of using the ground, the odonatans use specialized structures called secondary genitalia that are located on another part of their body. So these are not true genitalia. These are secondary structures, modifications of the sternal region of the basal segments of the abdomen that will hold the spermatozoa of the male. And because of that, they engage in this very unique copulatory, what shall we call it, stance in which, in order to mate, the female grasps, the male grasps the female by the cervix, basically by the back of the neck behind the head. So with the apex of his abdomen, the tip of his abdomen. So you have a male clamped onto the head or the neck of a female. She then reaches her abdomen forward and underneath to those secondary genitalia of the male in order to get the sperm. In this situation in which the male's got the female by the head and the female's articulated with the male secondary genitalia underneath his abdomen, leads to what's called the tandem or the wheel formation, during which sperm transfer is taking place. I've already mentioned the two suborders of these creatures, so let's take a look at some of them. You didn't know it, but I was gone there for a second. It seems that I can't start the video with my laser pointer, so hopefully now that I've got the little finger pointing, I'll be able to start this video. So this is a video showing a dragonfly in flight, and what I want you to pay attention to is the relative motion of the wings as this insect is flying. Let's see if it works this time. Yes, excellent. Notice how he's got the legs tucked up underneath the body. And right now they're kind of going together, but watch as it starts to maneuver around a bit. Now you see we're losing the synchrony between the fore and the hind wings. It's going to go through a little aerial acrobatics. Here we go. Now you see, whoa, they're like 180 degrees out of phase here as it flies across. So that's unique in insects, at least amongst the ones that have any ability to fly at all. super slow motion. Notice also how the legs are directed forwards. The whole thorax of an odonate is tipped on its side. Not tipped on its side. It's tilted backwards. So the true dorsum is actually now pointing posteriorly a little bit, pushing the legs forward. And this is true of all damselflies and dragonflies. And if you look at the thorax, the pleural suture, which is supposed to be a dorsal-ventral suture, is actually tilted toward the posterior end of the animal. Okay, let's move on here. This is a portrait of an immature dragonfly, I believe. Can't see too much of it there. And what we're seeing here, here's the antennae, the compound eyes, one here, one back here, out of focus. But this whole structure here is actually the labium, which has become enlarged, and it actually folds up over the front of the face of the animal, covering the rest of the mouth parts often. And that's why it's called a labial mask, because it's kind of covering the face. Let's see the labial mask in action. Here it is. The video is the next one. Here's the labial mask pulled out. So underneath here, you can see the tips of the mandibles. You probably can't see that pointer, can you? But I'm not going to get rid of my pointer yet. But up underneath the head there, you can see the tips of the mandibles. You can see the antennae, and then you see the enlarged, elongated labium with these big spikes out at the tip. So let's take a look at this thing in action. So here we have an odonaton, and on the right side of the screen, before I start it, is kind of out of focus. I believe that is it's kind of out of focus and difficult to see. It could either be a mayfly, or probably more likely that's a damselfly larva. And so the big guy on the left is going to catch the damselfly on the right. In slow motion, let's see it do its business. Look at the reach that thing has. Impales it with those sharp claws, not true claws, but sharp points at the tip of the labium, and pulls it back into the mandibles and maxillae, where it'll chew it up and ingest it. Can we see that again? There we go. Whoa. I think these things could give you a real good nip under the right circumstances, because some of these nymphal dragonflies in particular can be quite large. I'll move forward, and now I'll go back to my laser pointer. I hope that's the highlighter. Here's the laser pointer. Very good. So I just wanted to show you a few of the common groups of dragonflies and damselflies that you will encounter. Again, just like mayflies, all adults of dragonflies, the Anisoptera, pretty much have the same sort of body plan. They look very, very similar. There's lots of details in the wing veins to help you to identify the different families. And also in the Zygoptera, in the damselflies, the adults, there's a little bit more diversity there, but they have the same general look and feel. So let's look at some of these common groups. The first couple of images here are of the most common family. I think that's very safe to say, the Libellulidae, or the common names, river skimmers or just skimmers. And actually we've just completed a three-year grant from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources to do a survey of the species of Odonata in Ohio, and it's at the point where every species of Odonata, I think probably in all of North America and in many parts of the world, has a common name to go along with it. I've never learned the darn common names, and so I'm just going to stick with referring to these things by family. By the way, that survey, hopefully there will be a book available on your Barnes & Noble bookshelf within a year or two. about the diversity of damselflies and dragonflies in Ohio and where you can find them and what they're doing in terms of their biology. Anyway, back to the skimmers, the libellulids. These are very, as I said, very common, very distinctive, probably the easiest, most distinctive character to recognize them, given all the diversity in wing patterns and color and such, is what's called this anal loop, which is shaped in the form of a boot. That's the way I learned it. You can kind of see it in this. It's a little bit, excuse me, a little bit out of focus. Let's take a look at another libellulid. And here, I think you can see the boot coming down a little bit more clearly. Super common. Typically, well, I mean, the immature stages are all aquatic, although dragonflies will travel quite extensively as adults, and they must be fooled by things like blacktop or cars glinting in the summer sun, because they seem to congregate around these areas as if they were bodies of water. Libellulids around all kinds of bodies of water. Some of them are called river skimmers, so they're characteristic typically of larger rivers. Any lodic body of water, that is non-running water. Not so much the small woodland streams, but you know, they're not entirely missing from there either. Found throughout the country, throughout Ohio, lots of species. The most diverse group of dragonflies in North America. Then this is a family called the cordylogastrids. Can't really see it in this picture, but they're characterized by the absence of what's called a brace vein coming off the base of the stigma. The stigma are these dark black spots. I think I mentioned last time that commonly a stigma is a blood sinus within the wing, and most dragonflies have a brace vein coming off this side here, whereas the cordylogastrids do not. These are not many species. These are typical of woodland streams, that they'll follow the little streams up and down. You can catch these things, find these things in Hocking Hills and areas like that along some of the intermittent streams there. They will fly generally low to the ground. Some of them will even, I believe this is the family, they'll even come and land on you. They're so brave, as it were. The family Eschnidae is very interesting. It's a very large, physically large group, and very adept flyers, even for dragonflies. Sometimes these things will occur in huge swarms, which is probably not so much migrations. I was contacted by a newspaper, I forget which press agency it was, last year, I believe, asking about the existence of these swarms. They were picking them up on radar. There's so many numbers. I think it's mostly a meteorological phenomenon that ends up congregating these guys together into these large swarms. Here we see a male and female pair. You can see there's some sexual dichromatism in males versus females. That's the male on the left grasping the back of the head of the female here with his claspers. She is actually, at this point, has already gotten the sperm from the male. His secondary genitalia is in this enlarged area here. She's already gotten those spermatozoa, and she is ovipositing. Most dragonflies, things like the libellulids, will simply, in order to oviposit, they will fly along and just drop eggs into the water, or perhaps they'll hover and put their abdomen down, the tip of the abdomen down into the water. But eschnids actually have an appendicular ovipositor with which they insert their eggs into plant materials. So these two dragonflies are sitting on a floating reed in the water. She puts her eggs inside of there. Presumably, well, who knows? I have some ideas why, but for more protection. Most dragonflies simply drop them into the water. This is a corduliid, another family that, let's see, it's characterized by this elongate anal loop here with a vein that runs down the center of it. Again, this is another small group of dragonflies in terms of numbers of species. They're fairly large individuals. And then a final family I wanted to show you of dragonflies are the gomphids. And you can see why gomphids have the common name of club tails. They have the apical segments of the abdomen enlarged to look like, basically, I don't know what else to call it except a club. Okay, I can use the Latin term. It has a clavate abdomen. Gomphids, again, not a whole lot of species, and they can be very difficult to distinguish to species because they're so similar to one another. Here are some immature stages of Anisoptera, and we saw the previous video with the labial mask in use. I'm going to show you a couple of common habiti, body shapes of dragonfly larvae here. But the main thing to notice is that they do have gills at the posterior end of the abdomen, but the gills are contained within an expanded rectum back here. And so these animals draw water into the rectum, and then oxygen is transferred across the surface of the gills within the rectum, and then they can inject that water. They can also use this ability to draw water into the rectum and eject it as a last ditch method of quick escape, basically jet propulsion to shoot themselves through the water. So many species have this sort of shape with kind of a large rounded abdomen. Things like echinids, though, are much more elongate and can be quite large. I mean, they can be as long as your finger. So that's why I think they could probably give you a pretty good little nip. Again, these are exopterygote insects, not endopterygote insects. So the wings are developing as wing pads externally. 4 wings here, hind wing, 1 there, the other hind wing there. Then we'll move on to the Zygoptera. They're basically, I'm going to show you 4 groups of Zygoptera, 3 of which you will commonly encounter in this part of the world. The first and the very most common is the family Synagrionidea. They all have their individual common names. The species in this genus are commonly called bluets, and you can understand why they're called that. And they can be fairly difficult to distinguish the species. The relative size of some of these black splotches can be hints as to how to identify them. They also have different colors between the males and the females sometimes, so they can be difficult to identify beyond saying, oh, that's a species of Synagrion or something like that. Even though these insects are smaller and more delicate than dragonflies, they too are active aerial predators, catching very small insects on the wing. Oh, I can also point out in this picture, you can see clearly here, this is actually a line, this black line here on the thorax. Morphologically speaking, that line is running dorsoventrally. It should be going from top to bottom, right? Dorsoventral. But you can see how the entire thorax has been tilted backwards. And so now the dorsum is over here at almost the posterior end of the thorax and not in what you would think, where you would think the dorsum would be. This, I can tell, is a female. Here we have another family called the Lestidae, and one of the common names for these is called the spread wing damselflies, because when at rest, most species hold their wings outstretched rather than folded, not flexed, but folded over the top of the body, as you saw in that Synagrionid. Not as many species. They tend to be a little bit larger, but another fairly common group here in central Ohio. And then my favorite are the Calopterigids, the broad-winged damselflies. Some of these are just absolutely gorgeous. This picture is, at least on my screen here, is showing up a little bit dark. They They are dark. Well, this species is dark colored, but they will have metallic green or metallic blue highlights on the body here. And these kinds of species. This is the genus Calopteryx, which it's in Greek that would mean literally beautiful wing. They have darkened wings, and the stigma, instead of being black on a clear background, you see they're white on a black background, suggesting to me, I hadn't really thought of this before, but it's suggesting to me that these animals are signaling to each other in some way with their wings, with the stigma. I'll bet there's a whole literature on that I've never explored. Maybe somebody can look it up for me. So these are very common in this form. Another common Calopterygid, typically, at least in my experience, typical of slightly larger streams. Species like this you can find amongst just tiny little streams in the forest. This is the ruby spot, American ruby spot, the genus Heterina. Here it's called the ruby spot because of the base of the wings is this vivid red color, whereas the rest of it is more or less clear or hyaline, as we would say. So these are Calopterygids. So around here, those are the three families you're going to run into most commonly: Synagrionids, Lestids, and Calopterygids. But there's another group of Zygoptera, of damselflies, that I really wanted to show you as well. Oh, I did review the slides. I just forgot the order when I was going to pull up the immature stages. Let me show you the immature stages of the damselflies that you'll find around here. I have no idea which family this immature belongs to, this naiad, but I can tell that it's a zygopteran because it has external gills and at the caudal end of the abdomen, at the back end of the abdomen. And so these large paddle-shaped gills, 3 in number, are characteristic of a zygoptera. Remember, the Anisoptera have the gills within the rectum. Another picture, I'm obscuring the gills at the tail end here. They also have a labial mask, and again, just like the dragonflies, the immature stages here are also predatory. Okay, so this is the last group of damselflies that I want to show you. This is a group called the Pseudostigmatidae. That's the name of the family. Now, they are tropical in distribution. I'm not sure, they might sneak up into the most southern parts of Texas. I don't recall. But these creatures, not only are they beautiful, but they are amazingly large. And what they do, their biology is very interesting. They are not closely associated with bodies of water. Rather, they live in forests in which there are small bodies of water, phytotelmata, or little cup-like containers of water in the plants and that kind of thing, where they breed. But so these things are flying through forests, and when they fly, basically this hugely elongate abdomen is basically held straight down. Where's my finger? Straight down, and the wings are flapping, so it kind of looks like a little helicopter going through, or maybe a drone these days we should call it, right? Flying through the forest. And they're predatory, but what they do is they are searching out for spider webs, and they are specialists at grabbing the spiders out of their webs in order to feed on them. So these are very, to me, very charismatic tropical damselflies. Finally, I wanted to illustrate this business about copulation in Odonata, and I've got some damselfly pictures that illustrate this. So by now you should recognize this is a mating pair in the tandem position, male grasping the female by the cervix. Here's the female with her abdomen, and the male's secondary genitalia are up here. And so she's going to reach up and not only get the spermatozoa from the male, but the males, the sneaky devils that they are, have structures that are capable of basically scooping out any spermatozoa that this female may have acquired from another male, so that he can ensure that his sperm are going to be the ones that fertilize the next eggs to be laid. Here we've got a pair of dragonflies that are in the full wheel position here. Male holding the female, female reaching forward, attaching the end of her abdomen where the gonopore is here on the, let's see if I can count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think there's another segment back here. So the 9th segment, maybe that's the 8th, but she's attached that to the secondary genitalia of the male. The male has normal genitalia here, and that's what he's using to hold on to the female, and that's what he uses to put his spermatozoa here. So the male testes do not, through the ejaculatory duct, do not within the body reach to the secondary genitalia. He has to curl his abdomen around and place the spermatozoa in the secondary genitalia. Anyway, this is the wheel position, showing a male grasping a female, the female reaching forward to the secondary genitalia to be fertilized, to acquire sperm. And here we see the same thing in a pair of damselflies. And you can see this is one of those species where the females are green. These are Synagrionids, I believe, and the males are blue in color. So when you see that in the wild, I mean, they'll fly in this position, and so they're fairly easy to catch if they're actually copulating like this. But you know they're mating, and you know which sex is which. And this is just a close-up at the base of the abdomen of a dragonfly, showing the secondary genitalia, and they can be quite complex, almost medieval in their structure, both to something for the female to grasp onto, something for the male to be able to facilitate the sperm holding and then transfer to the female, and also the ability to clean out the female's reproductive system of any spermatozoa she may have picked up from a previous mating. All very Dr. Ruth, don't you think? So, a quick summary here. For the extant Paleoptera, there are some characteristics that they share in common, but by no means is the jury in on whether or not extant Paleoptera form a monophyletic group. But they do have some things in common. They have aquatic immatures, and where the few dragonflies that don't are clearly secondarily have come out of the water to a more or less terrestrial lifestyle. They have no wing flexion. They have aerostate antennae on there. In the mayflies, this is my quick and dirty summary: boring adults and diverse immatures. All the adults more or less the same body plan, very short-lived, no feeding. Basically, the only thing they do is mate and reproduce. They are the only insects, living insects, that have an immature stage with functional wings. That's the subimago stage. And other things that you'll find distinctive about the Ephemeroptera are the paired penis in the male and the presence of those abdominal gills along the abdominal segments. So not just the apical gills at the end like you saw in the damselflies, but along each of those abdominal segments. The Odonata in general are predatory, both as adults and as immatures. And the real thing I wanted to stress here, other than give you a little look at some of the diversity that you can find in these groups, is this idea that they have this indirect sperm transfer via these tandem in wheel positions, in which the males use their secondary genitalia in order to transfer sperm to the females. So that's all for today. I think the next time, what are we going to get into? We're going to get into the Polyneoptera, a real diverse group of insects that, morphologically speaking, are very difficult to define, but the molecular data support the idea that this forms a monophyletic group. But that's my tease for the next video. We'll get there next week. So until we do, stay safe. Thunderstorms tomorrow. Happy St. Patty's Day. We'll see you soon.